The pawnbroker's loupe caught the gaslight and threw a small circle of glare across the counter. Eleanor Thornbury kept her hands flat on the glass while he turned her mother's rubies over in his fingers. She had learned, over 3 winters, exactly how still a person must hold themselves to keep a tremor from reaching the surface. "Scuffed gold," Hemlock muttered, not looking up. "Heavy cut, out of fashion." "Burmese stones," Eleanor said. "You know their worth." "I know what the market will bear, Mrs. Thornbury. £12. She did not flinch. She had buried a husband, a house, and a name that once opened every door in London, and she was not going to let a man with ink-stained cuffs see her flinch over £12. 25. 15. And that only because you have brought me good pieces before. The rain against the shop window had not let up since morning. Eleanor watched it run in crooked lines down the glass and thought of the coal scuttle standing empty in her room, and the 4 shirts on her table still wanting collars, and did the arithmetic she had grown far too skilled at doing. 15, she agreed. She took the notes without counting them in front of him, folded them once, and slid them into her glove. She left the empty velvet box on the counter. It felt wrong to carry home a box with nothing inside it worth keeping. She did not see the tall shape standing near the grandfather clocks at the back of the shop, nor hear the low, controlled breath of a man who had gone very still the moment she walked in. By the time she reached her lodgings, the rain had soaked through her coat to the shoulder seams. She hung it by the cold stove, wrung the hem of her skirt over the basin, and sat down at the table with the shirts. The candle had perhaps 30 minutes left. Eleanor watched the wax pool and drip onto the tin plate beneath it, and did the arithmetic without meaning to. 30 minutes of light, 4 shirts still unfinished, no coal until Friday. Outside her window, Spitalfields exhaled its usual gray breath. Smoke from 100 chimneys pressed flat against the rooftops. Somewhere below, a costermonger shouted the last of his bruised apples for half price. Eleanor's fingers had gone stiff around the needle. She flexed them once, twice, and kept stitching. There was a knock at the door downstairs. Not the landlady's knock, heavier. 2 beats and a pause, the way a man knocks when he already expects to be let in. She set down the shirt. Her fingers were bandaged at the tips, the cotton gone brown at the seams where the needle had bitten too many times to count. She wrapped a shawl over her shoulders and went to the top of the stairs, listening. "Mrs. Thornbury does not receive visitors," came Mrs. Higgins' voice, thin and suspicious. "She will receive me," said a second voice, low, unhurried, a voice used to rooms falling silent when it spoke. Eleanor's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. She knew that voice. She had not heard it in 4 years, and still her body remembered it before her mind could catch up, the way a hand remembers a burn long after the skin has healed. She went down the stairs slowly, one hand trailing the damp wall for balance. Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Cravenmoor, stood in the narrow hallway of a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and river damp. He filled the space wrong somehow. Too tall, too clean. His black coat unmarked by the mud that clung to everything else in this street. He was holding a small velvet box. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She knew that box. She had left it on a pawnbroker's counter not 4 hours ago, along with the last thing of her mother's she had left to sell. "You followed me," she said. "I was already in the shop." His eyes did not leave hers. "Hemlock was fetching something of my brother's. I did not intend to see anything." "And yet you bought back what I sold." "I did." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the drip of water from a cracked gutter outside. "Give me a moment with the lady," the Duke said to Mrs. Higgins, without raising his voice. The landlady's suspicion evaporated the instant she registered the signet ring on his hand. She retreated, muttering something about putting the kettle on for his grace, though there had been no coal for a kettle in that house for weeks. Eleanor did not invite him further than the hallway. "Why are you here, Edmund?" "Because 3 years ago I returned from the continent to bury my brother, and I discovered along the way that Thomas Winfield had also died, and that his widow had simply disappeared from every drawing room in London." He said it plainly, the way another man might report the weather. "It took my solicitor 2 days to find you. I did not like what he found." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She had spent 3 years building a wall brick by brick, and she was not about to let one duke with an inconvenient memory knock it down in her landlady's hallway. "How long have you known?" she asked. 2 days. My solicitor is thorough." Edmund's eyes moved briefly to the bandages on her fingers before returning to her face, as though he had made himself a rule about where he was allowed to look and meant to keep it. "I would have come sooner if I had known sooner." "To do what? Rescue me?" The word came out sharper than she intended. "I did not ask to be found, Your Grace. I did not send word to anyone when Thomas died. Not to his family, not to mine. I chose this street." "No one chooses this street." "I chose it over asking my brother for charity and hearing him remind me at every Sunday dinner for the rest of my life that he warned me against Thomas at the altar." She folded her arms, bandaged fingers tucked out of sight beneath the shawl. "I would rather stitch collars until my eyes fail than owe my family the satisfaction of having been right." Something in Edmund's expression shifted, not quite a smile, more the settling of a man who has just had a suspicion confirmed. "Then you will understand," he said, "why I have not come to offer charity." "I am managing," she said. "You sold rubies to a man who tried to give you £12 for stones worth 10 times that." "I negotiated him to 15. That is more than managing. That is skill." Her chin lifted. "You may keep your pity for someone who asked for it." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "I have not come to offer pity," he said. "I have come to offer a position." Eleanor blinked. Of every sentence she had braced herself to hear, that one had not been among them. "A position?" "Westford Hall requires a steward with a mind for figures and no patience for foolishness. I have neither the time nor the temperament to manage the northern accounts myself, and every man I have hired in the last year has proven either dishonest or dull." He held her gaze, steady as a closed ledger. "You debated the Prime Minister's economic policy at a garden party in Kent while holding a plate of strawberries. I have not forgotten it, even if you have." Eleanor felt heat climb her neck. She had forgotten that afternoon. She had not forgotten him standing at the edge of it, listening far more carefully than a young man usually listened to a girl who talked too much about crop yields. "You want to hire your friend's widow to keep your household books." "I want to hire the sharpest mind I have ever met, who happens to be in need of a roof that does not leak." He set the velvet box on the narrow hall table between them. "The rubies are yours. I will not have you think I bought your compliance with them. Consider the positions separately. Consider it tonight." He turned for the door, then paused, his hand on the frame. "There is a carriage at the end of the street. It will wait until dawn, in case you find you have decided before I am obliged to ask again." The door shut behind him. Rain swallowed the sound of his footsteps almost at once. Eleanor stood alone in the dim hallway, staring at the velvet box. She opened it. The rubies caught what little light there was. Dark red, heavy, exactly as she remembered them the night Thomas had slid them onto her ears and promised her a life that never once required a needle. She closed the box. Upstairs, 4 shirts sat unfinished on the table, and the candle had perhaps 20 minutes left. She thought of the ledger books at Westford, of the northern moors she had never seen, of a man who had just offered her the one thing no one had offered her in 3 years. Not comfort, not charity. Work. She thought of the carriage waiting at the end of the street, its lamps no doubt already lit against the dark, and of how easily a woman could vanish into a decision like that, and never fully know, until it was far too late, exactly what she had agreed to become. She picked up her shawl. The carriage was still there. Eleanor stood at the end of the street with her single trunk at her feet, rain dripping from the brim of her bonnet, and watched the lamps flicker against the dark like a question she had not yet answered. She had left the velvet box locked in the bottom drawer of her dresser. She had left the rent paid through the week, in case she changed her mind before the week was out. She had told herself, climbing into the carriage, that this was a position, nothing more. The road north took 3 days. She spent the first reading Westford's account books by the gray light through the carriage window, her finger tracing columns of figures until the numbers blurred with the jolting of the wheels. She spent the second saying almost nothing at all, watching hedgerows give way to stone walls give way to open moor. By the third day, the trees had thinned to nothing, and the wind came at the carriage sideways, rattling the glass in its frame. Edmund rode ahead on horseback most of the way. When he did ride beside the carriage window, he spoke only of the estate, tenants, yields. A bailiff in the south fields he suspected of skimming the accounts. He never once asked how she had slept, or whether she was cold, or what she thought of leaving London behind for good. Eleanor told herself she preferred it that way. Westford Hall rose out of the moor like something that had grown there rather than been built. Dark stone against a sky the color of wet slate. Smoke poured from a dozen chimneys. A pack of hounds set up a racket in the courtyard the moment the carriage wheels struck the gravel. Eleanor stepped down and looked up at it, at the sheer scale of the place, and felt something in her chest that she refused to call hope. "This way," Edmund said, and did not offer his arm. The housekeeper, a broad woman named Mrs. Pemberton, met them at the door with a lantern and a look that took Eleanor's measure in one pass and seemed satisfied with the result. "Her ladyship's rooms are aired, and the fire's been going since Tuesday, Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said, already reaching for the trunk before a footman could beat her to it. "And there's a supper waiting that won't keep much longer, not in this wind." Eleanor followed her through a hall hung with portraits of Ashworths, going back further than she cared to count, past a staircase wide enough to march a regiment up, and into rooms warmer and larger than any she had occupied since her wedding night. She did not sleep well the first week. The silence of the moor was a different silence than London's, one with no costermongers and no rattling omnibuses to fill it, only wind and the occasional distant cry of something hunting in the dark. She lay awake listening to it, and found, to her own surprise, that she preferred it to the noise she had left behind. Within a week, the bandages came off her fingers. Within a month, the hollows in her cheeks had filled, thanks to the quiet procession of stews and roasted meats that appeared in her study without comment, as though the kitchens had simply decided she required feeding and gone about it without asking permission. She attacked the estate's ledgers the way she had once attacked a plate of strawberries at a garden party, with an appetite that startled the staff. She found £3,000 bleeding out of the household accounts through nothing more than carelessness, and closed the leak within a fortnight. She dismissed a bailiff in the southern fields whose numbers had never once matched his harvest reports. She renegotiated the coal contracts with a Yorkshire foreman who left the meeting looking as though he had been through a hedge backwards. When the steward, a greying man named Harrison, complained to Edmund that the new Duchess of the accounts was questioning invoices that had gone unquestioned for a decade, Edmund only poured a glass of whiskey and said, without looking up, that Harrison would do well to ensure his invoices could survive questioning. It was the respect that unsettled her most. Eleanor had braced herself, in the first weeks, for the moment Edmund would come to collect on his investment. She knew how these arrangements worked. She had been married once to a man who praised her mind at dinner parties and forgot she had one the moment the door to their bedroom closed. She waited for the late knock. She waited for the quiet, reasonable demand dressed up as affection. It never came. He had given her the old Duchess's rooms in the East Wing, an entire corridor and 2 staircases away from his own. They dined together most evenings and worked side by side in the library most nights, the only sound between them the scratch of pens and the settling of the fire. If their hands brushed while passing a ledger across the desk, he withdrew his with a speed that felt to Eleanor almost like an insult. One evening in late October, Harrison had come to the library door still holding his coat, having ridden out in the rain rather than wait until morning to voice his grievance. "Your Grace, if I might speak plainly, the new arrangements in the lower valley are not how things have been done at Westford." "Then I expect they will be done differently going forward," Edmund said, not looking up from his correspondence. Harrison's eyes had cut to Eleanor, seated at the far end of the desk, with 3 ledgers open in front of her, and something in his expression had curdled. "With respect, sir, a woman managing tenant contracts is not. Her Grace has increased the estate's projected yield by 1/5 in 2 months, Harrison. I find I have very little patience left over for what is or is not customary." Edmund had finally looked up, and whatever Harrison saw in his face was enough to end the conversation. The steward had bowed himself out without another word, and Eleanor had kept her eyes on her ledger, hiding whatever had risen in her chest at hearing it defended so plainly and without being asked. By the time the first snow closed the roads, she had stopped waiting for the knock altogether. In its place had grown something far more difficult to manage, a quiet in the house that had nothing to do with peace. It happened on a Tuesday, with the wind screaming off the moor and rattling the library windows in their frames. "The tenancy agreements in the lower valley are finished," Eleanor said, into the silence. "Signed this morning." "Good." Edmund did not look up from his book. Harrison said there was pushback on the yield requirements. There was. I offered a share of the surplus instead. They signed within the hour. "You are a formidable woman, Eleanor." The praise landed the way it always did lately, warm and entirely useless, like a fire seen through glass. She closed the ledger with more force than the moment required. "We are solvent, Edmund. The debts are cleared. Next year's projections show growth for the first time in 5. She stood, rounding the desk, her skirts hissing against the old rug. "By any measure you set for me, the position is fulfilled." Something shifted in his face, though he kept his voice level. "There is no expiry to a household, Eleanor." "Is that what I am? A household?" The words came out sharper than she meant them to, sharper than she had let herself be in months. "I have been here since autumn. You brought me out of that boarding house, handed me your books, and then retreated behind a wall so polite I could not find a single crack in it. Is that what you wanted? An accountant who happens to share your table?" "I have given you everything I promised. Respect, independence, safety." "Cruelty I could understand," she said, stepping closer, the careful distance of months collapsing without her permission. "Thomas was cruel, and at least I knew where I stood with him. Hemlock was cruel over £12, and I understood that too. But you—" She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the muscle working in his jaw. "You are unbearably kind, and I do not understand why." Edmund set down his book. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire cracked in the grate. Somewhere above them, a shutter came loose and beat once against the stone before the wind pinned it flat again. "Ask me anyway," Eleanor said again. Edmund's hands unclasped from behind his back. He did not reach for her. He stood very still, the way a man stands at the edge of something he has spent years refusing to fall into. "7 years ago," he said, "I stood in a garden in Kent and listened to a girl of 19 tear apart the Prime Minister's economic policy while holding a plate of strawberries she had entirely forgotten to eat." Eleanor's breath went shallow. "I intended to call on your father the following morning. Thomas called on you that same evening instead." His voice had gone rough at the edges, stripped of the flat, ledger-reading calm she had grown used to. "He was quicker. He was brighter. I told myself you had chosen well, and I buried myself in estate business rather than watch you marry him." "Edmund." "I attended the wedding. I raised a glass. I told myself that was the end of it." He looked at her now, fully, in a way he had avoided doing for months. "And then I came home from the continent and found you selling your mother's rubies to a man who tried to cheat you out of half their worth. And I discovered that none of it had ended at all." The fire popped in the grate. Neither of them moved to tend it. "You said this was a position," Eleanor whispered. "I lied." The word came out plain, unadorned, the way he said everything that mattered most. "I told myself it was a kindness, giving you work instead of charity, because I knew your pride would take one and refuse the other. But I did not bring you to Westford for the accounts, Eleanor. I brought you here because I could not spend one more year in a house that did not have you in it." She stood close enough now to see the unsteady rise of his chest, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him despite the wind battering the windows. "Why did you never say so?" "Because I have watched what happens to you when men make promises they cannot keep." His jaw tightened. "I did not want to be one more voice telling you I loved you while asking something of you in return. I wanted you to have a roof and safety and your own name back, whether or not you ever looked at me the way I have not stopped looking at you since a garden party in Kent." Eleanor reached up, and for the first time in 7 years, she let her hand rest flat against his chest, over the place where his heart beat far too quickly for a man who spoke so calmly. "I have signed contracts for you these 5 months," she said. "Tenancy agreements, coal leases, every figure in this house has passed through my hands." Her fingers curled slightly into the wool of his coat. "I would like to negotiate one more." Something in Edmund's face broke open, the careful composure of the last 5 months finally giving way. "Name your terms." "I do not want a duchess's apartments, a corridor away from yours. I do not want a husband who withdraws his hand every time it brushes mine over a ledger." Her voice, usually so steady, wavered on the last word. "I want the thing you have been too careful to offer me." He framed her face with both hands then, his thumbs tracing along her cheekbones, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all. "You have always had it," he said. "I was only waiting to be asked." He kissed her the way a man kisses when restraint has finally cost more than it is worth, and Eleanor rose onto her toes to meet him, one hand still fisted in his coat, as though she meant never to let the fabric go. The wind screamed against the library windows. The fire cracked and settled. Neither of them noticed. They stayed like that a long while, until the candles had burned low and the storm outside had softened to a steady, ordinary rain. Edmund finally drew back only far enough to look at her, his forehead resting against hers, his hands still cradling her face, as though he feared letting go might undo everything that had just been said. "I should have told you in Kent," he murmured. "You were quicker with crop yields than with confessions," Eleanor said, and felt, rather than heard, the low sound of his laugh. "A fair criticism. I intend to spend considerably longer correcting it." Word of the engagement reached London within a fortnight, carried north to south by the sort of letters that traveled faster than any coach. Eleanor's brother wrote a stiff note of congratulation that she read twice and answered once, briefly, without apology for the years of silence between them. Society, which had once turned its shoulder to a ruined widow stitching collars in Spitalfields, now found itself remarkably eager to recall old friendships with the future Duchess of Cravenmoor. Eleanor did not attend a single dinner in London to receive their apologies. She stayed at Westford, buried in ledgers and wedding preparations in equal measure, and found she did not miss the drawing rooms even slightly. 3 weeks later, the frost had turned every window at Westford Hall into a sheet of white lace, and the whole house smelled of cloves and roasting chestnuts in preparation for a wedding breakfast that would be considerably smaller than the estate's grandeur suggested it ought to be. Eleanor stood in front of the mirror in the east wing, wearing a gown of deep green wool that Mrs. Pemberton had insisted was warmer than fashion demanded, and considerably more practical for a Yorkshire December. She opened the small drawer of her dressing table and took out the velvet box. She had not worn the rubies since the night in that boarding-house hallway when Edmund had first set them on the table between them. She lifted the gold settings now and fastened them at her ears, watching the stones catch the candlelight, dark red against her throat. A knock came at the door. Not Mrs. Pemberton's knock. "You are not meant to see the bride before the ceremony," Eleanor called, though she was already crossing to open it. Edmund stood in the doorway in his wedding coat, his cravat still slightly askew, as though he had dressed himself faster than his valet could manage the last details. "I could not wait for the vicar," he said. "Forgive the impropriety." "You have never once cared for propriety when it suited you to ignore it. Only where you are concerned." He held up a folded paper in one hand. "I'm not here to see the bride," he said. "I'm here to hand my future Duchess one final contract before the vicar claims her for the church." Eleanor took the paper and unfolded it. It was not a marriage settlement. It was a deed, the ink still fresh, transferring the northern accounts of Westford Hall into her name outright, independent of any husband, revocable by no one but herself. She read it twice, slowly, tracing each clause the way she had once traced columns of figures by candlelight in a room with no coal to spare. Her solicitor's training, hard-won over 5 months of ledgers, told her exactly what the document meant. No court in England could strip this from her, not even the man handing it to her now. "You had a solicitor draft this?" "3 weeks ago. I wanted it finished before I asked you anything else of you." Edmund's voice had none of its usual composure now. "I know what it cost you to trust a man with promises again. I did not want you to have to trust mine. I wanted you to have something no one could take back, whatever became of us." Eleanor looked up at him, the rubies swinging against her jaw. "You already had my answer, Edmund. I wanted you to have proof that required no one's permission but your own." He held out his hand. "Shall we, Your Grace?" Eleanor set the deed on the dressing table, slid her hand into his, and walked out to meet whatever came next, without once looking back at the room where she had spent 5 months learning how to trust a man who had never once demanded it of her. If Eleanor's choice moved something in you, tell us in the comments whether you would have taken the same terms she did. Like this video if you believe in love that asks nothing and gives everything. And subscribe for more stories of quiet devotion set against the grandest houses in England.